Well, hello everyone, and thank you for being here on a Sunday afternoon when you could probably be doing other things, but it's just lovely to see you. I'm going to read actually from two books, my last two, because I have been doing fiction, but then moved into nonfiction. So I'm going to read first from All That Belongs. This is the cover. It's a story of an archivist who is retiring, and even though she's been collecting and preserving the stories of others, the past of others, she has resisted looking at her own past, and in particular, the her odd uncle, Uncle Must, she calls him, and her brother, whom she has never grieved properly. And so the book takes place between her present life and going back to these two characters and her relationship with them. Um, it's a book about grief. About shame. Sorry, grief is on my mind, but about shame. So I was trying to decide what to read and then realized, oh, I'll just start at the beginning with the prologue. This is how it started, that year of my preoccupation with the dead. On my last day of work at the regional archives, just hours before my colleagues whisked me away to my retirement dinner, a couple from Australia stopped in with a request. I was hanging about the reception area with nothing to do. My desk was empty, files cleared, so I greeted them and helped them find the evidence of a second cousin they believed had lived and died in Winnipeg. Not that it matters one way or the other, they said, but since we're traveling through Canada anyway. They were delighted with what I discovered: a mention in the archives finding aid, a short article about the cousin's appointment to a contractor's firm, the death notice. They told me they'd heard he was a scoundrel, and they clapped their hands and laughed, as if this paucity of information confirmed their suspicions. The Australian woman was small and bony in appearance, clad in a flowing black garment, caftan style, rather too big for her, but she bubbled with eagerness and warmth, and this swelled into the dress. I was drawn to her. After the search, the woman and I discussed genealogy. I asked her how far back she could trace, and she said, to the first fleet of them, to the first shipment of convicts. Your forebears were convicts? I'd completely forgotten in that moment how Australia came to be populated with Europeans. Oh, yes, yes, convicts. There was a lilt in her voice. She said convict as easily as she'd said scoundrel. It may have been for something horridly horrible, she went on. Maybe slaying the master or a neighbor, or as trivial as stealing a rabbit from a rich man's woods. Her husband, who'd been distracted by files unrelated to the second cousin, lifted his head and chipped in with a bit of a speech. There was a patient of Carl Jung's, he said, who feared to accept things in his life lest they overpower him. But his fear turned out not to be true, as he learned to be receptive to all that belonged to him, good and bad, light and night continuously alternating. His world came alive. The woman touched his arm. Young, she said, as if this was his name. Yes, she told me. Young and his patient were right. This credo has served us well. She took her husband's hand and began to guide him out, the hem of her dress undulating around her legs like a wave goodbye. She stopped, called back. You've probably got something in your family, too. A little embarrassment. Family trees are rarely reassuring. I smiled and gestured indecisively, and they carried on through the exit. I felt a sensation of judgment rising and pressing against my heart. It felt like the vague heaviness that used to oppress me during evangelistic meetings in my childhood church, an inchoate insistence to which I always responded with fresh avowals of surrender to God. My past seemed unremarkable, but I was ashamed of it nevertheless. My odd uncle must, the whole lot of it, in fact, everything he dragged in his wake, everything in my chronology, the choke and pother of my earlier self, the losses, my brother, that slight souring at the edge of every bite. Uncle, yes, and everything, circumstance and disappointment, permeating like yeast. My assistant Joan was heading my way. She looked plump and superficial after the tiny woman in black, so I pretended I didn't see her and strode to the window. I stood stiffly and stared out as if not to be disturbed. I was caught up in the couple's words, in the personal history that weighted me suddenly, unexpectedly. The boulevard trees were almost bare, autumn light between their branches, weak and disconsolate, as if aching for green. That man and that woman, they'd caught me off guard, as if, released from these archives, I ought to be ready for my own. Outside, two boys rolled by on their skateboards, their shouts like ribbons, daring me to grab and hold. So young, I thought, so young and wonderful. Then they disappeared around the corner. Had I harbored shame for too long, been too fearful of overpowerment? You're an archivist, for pity's sake, Jim, who is the narrator's husband, had remarked to me once, you ought to be at home with your past. We were at a summer gathering of his family, and he and his brothers got each other going about their childhood, scooping up mutual antics like minnows, the pail sluicing over their voices, sounding ever wilder and happier, reminiscences like tin and clang to me and everyone else in the family who was sidelined by their hoots of conversation. Later, I chided him. Maybe enough of the boyhood, I said. He tensed and frowned. I saw the lines alongside his nose, shallow cracks I hadn't noticed before. I wanted to stroke those runnels of skin, ponder where the years had gone, but I couldn't risk touching him after he'd put me on the defensive. I said, I've never had the nerve to consider my past that fascinating, not like some. I'd paused, calmed myself, continued, honestly, Jim, for pity's sake, indeed, I'm not a rememberer. And he'd waited too, then said, I don't believe you for a second. But his voice had been fond, and it was fine between us again. Now I heard my colleague Lucy, noisy as she neared. Let's go, she cried. I told Jute that you and I are leaving early today. He's so busy writing his flowery director's speech about you, he couldn't refuse. I chuckled and turned. Jim slid out of mine, the Australians too. The street outside was empty now, the flow of traffic elsewhere, and perhaps the clouds had blown on, for in my final glance, the air seemed radiant, a strange excitement for remembrance, for welcome to all that belonged, stirred in me, nudged against my habitual resistance. It moved in me like the slip of water over stones. I was aware of it moving and rising, and it moved in me that entire evening, a murmur like arousal through the feasting toasts and many anecdotes of a wonderful dinner in my honor. So that's all that belongs. Um, More recently is the book Return Stroke, which happened sort of unexpectedly in some ways and quite quickly. And I'm grateful to CMU Press for bringing it out. It consists of 10 essays and a memoir of the 2.5 years that my husband and I spent in Paraguay with our 3 children. And it's quite diverse. It's got, besides the Paraguay memoir, it tells about the first books that my mother read me and how I kind of came to terms with them, and about my life as seen through the lens of food. It's about a child's coming out, about getting old. And most of the pieces had been either written already and in my files or were published in literary journals. The only one that I read or wrote new was the narrative of my husband's death. So I thought I would read from the title essay, just the opening section. Return stroke actually refers to lightning, although of course it has many other connotations. And the epigraph to this particular essay is from George Eliot's Middlemarch. While he was speaking, there came a vivid flash of lightning, which lit each of them up for the other. My father-in-law died before I was part of the family, so all I had were photos and secondhand stories by which to form him in my mind. What I cobbled together was a kind of effigy stuffed with impressions, a placeholder. At the beginning, it was the best I could do. I did not realize that I had become a biographer, that informally and privately I had embarked on capturing a version of his life. The first story, the most pressing and important, while my future husband Helmut and I were getting acquainted, concerned his father's death. It was recent, new. Heinrich was only 67. He had died alone. He dismounted his horse to rest beneath a tree and was overtaken by a fatal stroke. He had crossed the reins neatly over the animal's back. Helmut's older brother, who was at the ranch installing a fence, felt uneasy and went to look for his father. He discovered the horse waiting riderless and the peaceful, lifeless body. The death took place in Paraguay in the semi-arid Chaco, where Mennonite refugees from Russia had settled in the early 1930s. This is where Helmut, my then boyfriend, grew up. In 1970, adventurous and somewhat rebellious, he migrated to Canada, which is where we met. The news of his father's passing reached him by shortwave radio, and there was no possibility of attending the funeral. A letter followed with additional details. It was dreadfully hot and humid. There had been no wind. It started to drizzle as the older brother searched. That morning, before Heinrich, Helmut's papa, left the house, he stroked Mama's back, and when she said, as she always did, "Lass gut gehen," may it go well, he replied with, "Thank you," instead of his usual, "It will." Retrospectively, this seemed significant. I was given these bits while we dated. One evening over coffee, Helmut talked about his father, and suddenly he could not go on. Tears welled up and began to run. They seemed to run a long time. I was touched by his loss, by the fact that he cried. I wished to share his sorrow. Perhaps I was not expressing it properly, though, for he was embarrassed. He feared I thought him weak, that I may not have liked his breaking down. No, 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 not at all, I told him. I really cared. But it was the good-looking man I had fallen in love with who was the object of my concern. Papa was a word, only relevant because of this other, younger man I wished to get to know. I had never met Papa. How could I miss him? Since he had never appeared to me, how could he be as one who had disappeared? Still, the older man had appeared in a way. I had unwittingly launched myself on an endeavor regarding him, Victorian in character as it may have been, sentimental, sad, focused on the subject's death, finishing him off, that is, before he had even been alive to me. And I go on in the essay then to talk about how I began to build a sense of his life and to try to answer the question, which is the question beneath the practice of biography: is it possible to know someone you have never met. And the title refers partially to the fact that my father-in-law was struck by lightning when he was a young man, and also by a bit of an encounter between us quite late in my struggle to know him, which is when I discovered that he had kept diaries and I had a chance to read them. So that's it. Thank you very much.